Wealth. If the only questions about wealth concern the means of getting and keeping it, the causes of its increase and decrease, the idea of wealth would be confined to economics. The end of the medical art is health, writes Aristotle in the Ethics, and that of economics, wealth. But as the Ethics indicates, the moralist and the statesman are also concerned with health and wealth, not simply as things to get and keep, but in relation to all other goods and as constituents of the good life and the good society. What is regarded as the end in economics may be only a means in ethics and politics, in which case Aristotle suggests the latter sciences subordinate economics, even as politics subordinates military strategy, and military strategy the making and use of armaments. The discussion of riches in the tradition of the great books exhibits these two ways of considering wealth. The Bible, the poets, historians, and philosophers deal with wealth as a factor in the life of men and societies. They scrutinize the desire for wealth or the love of money in relation to sin and virtue. They raise questions of justice concerning the distribution of wealth, the rights of property, and fairness in exchange, in buying and selling, borrowing and lending, and in compensating the laborer. They will describe the effect of poverty and prosperity, or opulence, upon states, and prescribe the attitude which individual men as well as societies should take toward wealth and poverty. Throughout, it seems to be assumed that wealth is merely a means, however important or indispensable, though wealth may also be viewed as an end when the problem is one of how to acquire, produce, or increase it. The fact that, when possessed, it should be treated as a means leads the moralist to condemn not only the miser, the hoarder, or the man who devotes his whole life to making money, but also those who elevate wealth into the sort of end which justifies any means that can advance its pursuit. The other approach is that of the economist. Two of the great books, Smith's Wealth of Nations and Marx's Capital, deal not with wealth as a means, but with the means to wealth. A third, though by title A Discourse on Political Economy, is concerned with the principles of government and with wealth only insofar as, in Rousseau's conception, government includes the administration of property as well as the protection of persons. Provision for the public wants, he writes, is the third essential duty of government. Rousseau explains the title of his treatise by reference to the etymology of the word economy, which meant originally only the wise and legitimate government of the household for the common good of the whole family. It is in this sense that Aristotle employs the word, and that a work sometimes attributed to him bears it as the title. The meaning of the term, Rousseau goes on, was then extended to the government of the great family, the state. To distinguish these two senses of the word, the latter is called general or political economy, the former domestic or particular economy. Adam Smith uses the term more narrowly. Not only does he limit his inquiry to the nature and causes of wealth, but by specifying the wealth of nations, he restricts himself to political economy, which he says has two distinct objects. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. And secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. In saying that the political economist aims to enrich both the people and the sovereign, and that the great object of the political economy of every country is to increase the riches and power of that country, Smith takes wealth as an end, though it may also be a means, so far as power depends upon riches, and tries to formulate the natural laws of wealth making. Nowhere does he define the quantity of wealth which should satisfy a nation, the natural resources of a country, the size and industry of its population, and various unfavorable contingencies may set certain bounds to the maximization of wealth. Within these bounds, the country which adopts and follows a sound system of political economy, one which accords with the right conception of wealth and its causes, can and deserves to become as wealthy as possible. Yet Smith, in treating wealth as an end and its increase without limit as a good, does not make economics absolutely autonomous. He regards political economy as a part of politics, a branch of the science of a statesman or legislator, and to that extent implies that other considerations than wealth may control the policies of a nation in its regulation of agriculture, industry, domestic commerce, and foreign trade. Furthermore, the larger moral questions which accompany Smith's economic speculations in his lectures on jurisprudence and his earlier treatise of the moral sentiments are not entirely absent from the wealth of nations, but to the extent that he writes purely as an economist concerned with securing cheapness or plenty, or what for him is the same, wealth and abundance, he adheres to considerations of expediency and only infrequently permits himself obiter dicta on justice or questions of right and wrong. Karl Marx also writes as an economist. He details the factors which govern the production and distribution of wealth as these manifest themselves in the great historic systems of production: the slave economy, the feudal economy, the bourgeois or capitalist economy. So far as he is a scientist, and even more than Adam Smith, an historian, who describes how wealth is acquired and how it multiplies by reproducing itself. But Marx is much less content than Smith to stop there. Smith tries to describe the economic process scientifically in order to prescribe the means a nation should use to become increasingly prosperous. But Marx undertakes to describe it in order to criticize the way in which some men get richer than they need be, while others become poorer than they should be. His critical purpose makes inevitable the expression of moral judgments concerning such inequities, and by implication they are everywhere present. For example, a descriptive phrase like surplus value connotes unearned increment. An apparently neutral economic term like profit is given the invidious moral significance traditionally attached to usury. Nor does Marx rest with criticism. He has an economic program to propose, a program he reveals more clearly in the Communist Manifesto than in Capital. The aim is not primarily to increase the production of wealth, but to remedy its inequitable distribution under all past economic systems. The program looks forward to the final revolution, which will bring the necessary historic motion of progress to its culmination when socialism replaces capitalism. Smith and Marx, it appears, are not economists in the same sense. But it may be supposed that in spite of their different purposes, they would, as scientists, agree in their description of economic phenomena. To some extent, they do. Yet, the difference in their point of view and aim leads to a quarrel about facts, or at least about their interpretation. Classical economists in the tradition of Adam Smith dispute the consequences which Marx draws from the labor theory of value, especially with regard to the origin of profit from the surplus product of unpaid labor time. Profit seems to them as much a part of the natural price of commodities as the wages paid to labor and the rent paid to the landlord. In exchanging the complete manufacture, either for money, for labor, or for other goods, over and above what may be sufficient to pay the price of the materials and the wages of the workmen, something, writes Smith, must be given for the profits of the undertaker of the work who hazards his stock in this adventure. The value which the workmen add to the materials, therefore, resolves itself in this case into two parts, of which the one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer upon the whole stock of materials and wages which he advanced. He could have no interest to employ them, unless he expected from the sale of their work something more than what was sufficient to replace his stock to him. And he could have no interest to employ a great stock rather than a small one, unless his profits were to bear some proportion to the extent of his stock. It is precisely on this point of profit as a return for risking one's capital stock that Marx charges Smith, and after him, Ricardo and J.S. Mill, with being apologists for the capitalistic system. He quotes Mill's statement that the cause of profit is that labor produces more than is required for its support. The fact that Mill does not question the validity of this surplus value, which accrues as profit to the entrepreneur, the fact that Ricardo treats surplus value, according to Marx, as a thing inherent in the capitalist mode of production, which mode, in his eyes, is the natural form of social production, is explicable, in Marx's view, only if we recognize that their economic theories mix special pleading with science. These bourgeois economists instinctively saw, and rightly so, he says, that it is very dangerous to stir too deeply the burning question of the origin of surplus value. Though he distinguishes between its classical and vulgar forms, political economy for Marx is a bourgeois science which first sprang into being during the period of manufacture. Political economy has generally been content to take, just as they were, the terms of commercial and industrial life. Engels remarks in a prefatory note to Capital, and so it never went beyond the received notions of profit and rent, never examined this unpaid part of the product, called by Marx surplus product, in its integrity as a whole, and therefore never arrived at a clear comprehension either of its origin and nature, or of the laws that regulate the subsequent distribution of its value. Marx's work is, in his own conception of it, at one and the same time a criticism of the capitalist economy and of the science of economics, which accepts and defends that economic system. In his own preface to Capital, Marx tells the reader that the volume which I now submit to the public forms the continuation of an earlier work, a contribution to the critique of political economy, which the sphere of political economy as defined by the problem of augmenting a nation's wealth. The author of The Wealth of Nations similarly finds a critique of prevalent economic fallacies, those of the physiocrats and the mercantilists. Inseparable from the constructive statement of his own theory. Mercantilists. Economists engage in controversy over technical points in the analysis of production, exchange, and distribution, or in the development of theories of value and price, money and capital, property and poverty. Such controversy tends to become complicated both by the larger questions in which the economic issues are embedded, and also by the different points of departure and the different objectives of the economists. What at first may look like a simple issue of fact often fails, on closer examination, to be capable of resolution by scientific inquiry or simply by an accurate description of the phenomena. Even when all relevant matters of fact are determined, conflicting interpretations of their significance remain. Behind these lie divergent presuppositions, often unexpressed. Those who start with different conceptions of the problem and from different principles assumed rather than argued tend to reach conclusions which may appear to be opposed, but which do not really exclude one another, at least not totally. Each from its own point of view may be true, and from that point of view, the other is not so much false as irrelevant. Smith may be right, for example, when he says that the consideration of his own private profit is the sole motive which determines the owner of any capital to employ it either in agriculture and manufactures or in some particular branch of the wholesale or retail trade. The different quantities of productive labor which it may put into motion, and the different values which it may add to the annual produce of the land and labor of the society, according as it is employed in one or other of those different ways, never enter his thoughts. Smith may be right, not only as to the fact asserted, but also with regard to its implication for the increase of the nation's wealth. That the wealth of a society increases as owners of capital act from self-interest in a system of free enterprise which permits the possibility of profits to indemnify them against the risk of losses and to reward them for the thrift whereby they accumulated capital to invest productively. But Marx may also be right when he says that the system of free enterprise and capitalistic production could not have started simply through the thrift of individuals, but required a primitive accumulation of capital. Accumulation of capital, he says, presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalistic production. Capitalistic production presupposes the existence of considerable masses of capital and labor power in the hands of producers of commodities. The whole movement, therefore, seems to turn in a vicious circle, out of which we can only get by supposing a primitive accumulation, previous accumulation of Adam Smith, preceding capitalistic accumulation, a primitive accumulation which is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. He may be right, furthermore, when he goes on to say that the economic structure of capitalistic society has grown out of the economic structure of feudal society. The historical movement which changes the producers into wage workers appears, on the one hand, as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds. But on the other hand, these new freedmen become sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. It may be true that a capitalist who privately owns means of production would not invest them without the possibility of gaining a profit. It may be true, as Smith would insist, that he would not be justified in doing so. This, however, does not invalidate, as it is not invalidated by Marx's theory of the original expropriation, which in his opinion initiated capitalistic enterprise. Nor does it conflict with Marx's insistence that the capitalist must exploit labor in order to make profits, since he can derive them only from the surplus value created by wage laborers who produce more than is returned to them for their own needs or subsistence. The foregoing point and counterpoint in economic theory must serve as one example of the way in which Smith and Marx pass each other rather than meet on many of the basic economic issues. It would be impossible, within the compass of this introduction, to chart the intricate relationship of their thought, including their agreements and clear oppositions, as well as the matters on which they simply diverge, because they are discussing the same problem from different viewpoints. The reader can discover for himself in greater detail the pattern of conversation between these two great economists by studying the passages from their works which are cited in the references. As a glance at the outline of topics will show, many of the headings represent technical problems or issues in economic theory, as that is narrowly conceived in modern times. Some, however, are more general. They state themes which place the discussion of wealth in the larger context of moral and political questions, and which, throughout the whole tradition, engage poets, historians, and philosophers, not merely the economists of the 18th and 19th centuries. To some extent, the moral general themes are treated in other chapters, such as labor, justice, oligarchy, virtue and happiness, family and state. Here we shall consider them for their bearing on the nature and kinds, the sources and uses of wealth, and also its goodness and evil. The ancients conceive wealth as consisting in the variety of external goods which sustain life, food, clothing, and shelter. But wealth may include more than the bare necessities. When Socrates in the Republic outlines a simple economy which aims to satisfy only basic needs, Glaucon tells him that he is providing for a city of pigs. More is required, he says, for the ordinary conveniences of life. People who are to be comfortable are accustomed to lie on sofas and dine off tables, and they should have sauces and sweets in the modern style. Socrates replies by projecting a luxurious state, a state at fever heat, which goes beyond the necessaries such as houses and clothes and shoes. The arts of the painter and the embroiderer, he says, will have to be set in motion, and gold and ivory and all sorts of materials procured, and the city will have to fill and swell with a multitude of callings which are not required by any natural want. This distinction between necessities and luxuries, which has many implications for ethics and economics, as well as for politics, does not draw the line between natural and artificial wealth, nor is natural wealth identified exclusively with natural resources in their pure state, unconverted by labor for use or consumption. Wealth is generally thought to comprise all consumable goods, whether necessities or luxuries, whether products of hunting, agriculture, or manufacture, and all the means of producing them. Only money is excluded. Only money is declared to be either not wealth at all or artificial wealth. Yet, the confusion of money with wealth seems to be prevalent at all times, as repeated attempts to correct the fallacy indicate. The use of money originates, according to Aristotle, with retail trade, which is not a natural part of the art of getting wealth. For, he goes on, had it been so, men would have ceased to exchange when they had enough. What Aristotle calls retail trade replaces the barter of necessary articles. Made possible by the use of coin, retail trade, he says, comes to be thought of as the art which produces riches and wealth. Indeed, Aristotle continues, riches is assumed by many to be only a quantity of coin, but he agrees with those who maintain, to the contrary, that coined money is a mere sham, a thing not natural, but conventional only, because it is not useful as a means to any of the necessities of life. And he who is rich in coin may often be in want of necessary food. But how can that be wealth, of which a man may have a great abundance and yet perish with hunger, like Midas in the fable, whose insatiable prayer turned everything that was set before him into gold? To say that money in itself cannot satisfy any natural need does not imply that it serves no economic purpose. Plato and Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, and Kant, as well as Smith and Marx, understand the utility of money as a medium of exchange, indispensable for the circulation of commodities. To use Marx's phrase, beyond the stage of barter. Money is not only a medium of exchange, according to Plato, it reduces the inequalities and incommensurabilities of goods to equality and common measure. And Aristotle seems to anticipate Marx's conception of money as the universal form in which all economic values can be expressed when he defines wealth to mean all things whose value is measured by money. The economic utility of money in exchange and as a measure of value, or even the fact that gold and silver coin may have some intrinsic value because of the labor involved in mining and minting the metals, does not alter the distinction between natural and artificial wealth. Natural wealth, Aquinas explains, is that which serves man as a remedy for his natural wants, such as food, drink, clothing, cars, dwellings, and such like. While artificial wealth, such as money, is that which is not a direct help to nature, but is invented by man for the convenience of exchange, and as a measure of all things saleable. The same point is restated by Locke in the 17th century, but it is still necessary for Smith, a century later, to argue against the mercantilist theory of national prosperity on the ground that it confuses wealth with money. It would be too ridiculous to go about seriously to prove, Smith writes, that wealth does not consist in money, or in gold or silver, but what money purchases, and is valuable only for purchasing. Goods can serve many other purposes besides purchasing money, but money can serve no other purpose besides purchasing goods. Money, therefore, necessarily runs after goods, but goods do not always or necessarily run after money. The man who buys does not always mean to sell again, but frequently to use or consume, whereas he who sells always means to buy again. Nevertheless, that wealth consists in money or in gold and silver is a popular notion which naturally arises from the double function of money as the instrument of commerce and as the measure of value. The notion is so familiar that Smith observes, even they who are convinced of its absurdity are very apt to forget their own principles, and in the course of their reasonings to take it for granted as a certain and undeniable truth. Some of the best English writers on commerce set out with observing that the wealth of a country consists not in its gold and silver only, but in its lands, houses, and consumable goods of all different kinds. In the course of their reasonings, however, the land, houses, and consumable goods seem to slip out of their memory, and the strain of their argument frequently supposes that all wealth consists in gold and silver, and to multiply these metals is the great object of national industry and commerce. The two principles of the mercantilist policy are, according to Smith, that wealth consisted in gold and silver, and that those metals could be brought into a country which had no mines only by the balance of trade, or by exporting to a greater value than it imported. A favorable balance of trade thus necessarily became the sole object of the mercantilists, and Smith adds, its two great engines for enriching the country, therefore, were restraints upon importation and encouragements to exportation. Since, in his opinion, the wealth of a nation consists in the whole annual produce of its land and labor, Smith opposes all such restraints, and with them the protection of monopolies. He advocates free trade and the free competition of producers within a country, as well as between domestic and foreign producers on the ground that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. But in the mercantile system, Smith claims the interest of the consumer is almost constantly sacrificed to that of the producer. A laissez-faire economy, he thinks, not only reverses this situation, but also, by preferring more consumable commodities to more gold and silver, tends to increase the real, not the artificial wealth of a nation. Marx also criticizes the mercantilist error, but in terms of his theory that since the production of surplus value is the chief end and aim of capitalist production, the greatness of a man's or a nation's wealth should be measured not by the absolute quantity produced, but by the relative magnitude of the surplus value. Surplus value cannot be produced by exchange. Against the mercantilists who derived the excess of the price over the cost of production of the product from the act of exchange, from the product being sold above its value, Marx quotes Mill's statement that profit arises not from the incident of exchange, but from the productive power of labor, and the general profit of the country is always what the productive power of labor makes it, whether any exchange takes place or not. But this is not the whole picture, according to Marx. Although it is impossible for capital or surplus value to be produced by circulation or the exchange of commodities, he also thinks it is impossible that outside the sphere of circulation a producer of commodities can, without coming into contact with other commodity owners, expand value and consequently convert money or commodities into capital. The two sides of the picture are brought together in Marx's view by the treatment of labor itself as a commodity and the buying and selling of labor power in the open market. The distinction between real wealth and money, and the distinction between necessities and luxuries, have more than economic significance. They are basic to the moralists' strictures concerning the desire for wealth, its place in the order of goods, and the way it can be put to good use. It is not only St. Paul who says that the love of money is the root of all evil. It is not only Christian theologians like Augustine and Aquinas who explain how lust of the eyes, or covetousness, is a capital sin, and as such the principle of many other transgressions. As Marx points out, the Greeks also denounced money as subversive of the economical and moral order of things. In the passage in Sophocles' Antigone, which he quotes, Creon declares, "Nothing so evil as money ever grew to be current among men." This lays cities low. This drives men from their homes. This trains and warps honest souls till they set themselves to works of shame. This still teaches folk to practice villainies and to know every godless deed. Plato condemns the oligarchical state by comparing it to the miser and moneymaker among men. Such a state, he says, aims to become as rich as possible, a desire which is insatiable. In the laws, the Athenian stranger explains why the reasonable statesman should not aim to make the state, for the true interests of which he is advising, as great and as rich as possible, if he also desires to have the city the best and happiest possible. For though each may be possible alone, they are not possible together. It is impossible, he holds, to be good in a high degree and rich in a high degree at the same time. What Plato says of the oligarch, Marx says of the capitalist. He shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth, but Marx adds, that which in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy is in the capitalist the effect of the social mechanism, of which he is but one of the wheels. Involved as he is by the system in the restless, never-ending process of profit-making, the individual capitalist, like the miser, exhibits this boundless greed after riches, this passionate chase after exchange value. The root of the evil and the love of money, of gold, yellow, glittering, precious gold, which Shakespeare calls the common whore of mankind, is the boundlessness of the lust. The hoarding of anything springs from an insatiable desire. But because money can be converted into every sort of commodity, it is, according to Marx, the ideal object of hoarding. The antagonism between the quantitative limits of money and its qualitative boundlessness, he writes, continually act as a spur to the hoarder in his Sisyphus-like labor of accumulating. In the light of such observations, Marx cites with approval Aristotle's distinction between economic and crematistic, or what Aristotle differentiates as the two arts of wealth-getting. Considering economics as the management of a household, Aristotle says that the art of acquisition, which is a natural part of it, must either find ready to hand or itself provide such things necessary to life and useful for the community of the family or state as can be stored. They are the elements of true riches, for the amount of property which is needed for a good life is not unlimited. But there is another variety of the art of acquisition, which is commonly and rightly called an art of wealth-getting, and has in fact suggested that riches and property have no limit. The two arts tend to become confused in men's minds. Some persons are led to believe, Aristotle observes, that getting wealth is the object of household management, and the whole idea of their lives is that they ought either to increase their money without limit, or at any rate not to lose it. The origin of this disposition in men is that they are intent upon living only, and not upon living well, and as their desires are unlimited, they also desire that the means of gratifying them should be without limit. Even those who do aim at a good life seek the means of obtaining bodily pleasures, and since the enjoyment of these appears to depend upon property, they are absorbed in getting wealth, and thus there arises the second kind of wealth-getting. Plato, like Aristotle, while admitting the service of retail trade in effecting the exchange of commodities, condemns the tendency of its practitioners to make gains without limit. In the Laws, furthermore, he prohibits interest on loans, and in the Republic, He describes this form of money making as a process in which men of business insert their sting, that is, their money, into someone else who is not on his guard against them, and recover the parent sum many times over multiplied into a family of children. This biological metaphor for making money out of money appears also in Aristotle. The term interest, he says, means the birth of money from money. Of all forms of money making, this breeding of money is, in his opinion, the most unnatural. Usury, which makes a gain out of money itself, Aristotle writes, violates the natural object of money, intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. Interest and usury are not distinguished in the Old Testament. Take thou no usury of him, or increase, is the command in Leviticus. But this rule does not apply to the stranger. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, Deuteronomy says, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury. A theologian like Aquinas, following both Scripture and Aristotle, condemns for Christians all interest as usury. And Luther also appeals to pagan precept as well as to scriptural warrant. The heathen were able, by the light of reason, to conclude that a usurer is a double-dyed thief and murderer. Luther says in a passage which Marx quotes, under the comment that the usurer is that old-fashioned but ever-renewed specimen of the capitalist, castigating his fellow Christians for holding usurers in such honor that we fairly worship them for the sake of their money. Luther declares that whoever eats up, robs, and steals the nourishment of another, that man commits as great a murder, so far as in him lies, as he who starves a man or utterly undoes him, such does a usurer. It seems to be a later consequence of the Protestant Reformation, as Weber and Tawney point out, that the exaction of interest for the loan of money or goods is defended, and only exorbitant rates of interest are denounced as usurious. The signs of the change may be seen in Pascal's diatribe against the specious casuistry, which tries to exempt some forms of interest-taking from the charge of usury, and also in the fact that Montesquieu attributes to the schoolmen who adopted from Aristotle a great many notions on lending upon interest, the mistake of condemning it absolutely and in all cases. In his opinion, to lend money without interest is certainly an action laudable and extremely good, but it is obvious that it is only a counsel of religion and not a civil law. Montesquieu thinks a price for the use of money is necessary for the carrying on of trade. If a fair rate of interest is not allowed, nobody will lend money. Or rather, Montesquieu says, because the affairs of society will ever make it necessary. Money lending will inevitably take the form of usury. Usury increases in Mohammedan countries, he points out, in proportion to the severity of the prohibition. The lender indemnifies himself for the danger he undergoes of suffering the penalty. Smith agrees that prohibition, instead of preventing, has been found from experience to increase the evil of usury. A fair rate of interest is justified, he thinks, because as something can everywhere be made by the use of money, something ought everywhere to be paid for the use of it. In countries where interest is permitted, the law, in order to prevent the extortion of usury, generally fixes the highest rate which can be taken without incurring a penalty. This rate ought always to be somewhat above the lowest market price, or the price which is commonly paid for the use of money by those who can give the most undoubted security. Smith offers the British practice as a good example, where money is lent to government at 3% and to private people upon good security at 4 and 4.5. The present legal rate, 5%, is perhaps as proper as any. Interest and profit, while not the same in Smith's view, are closely connected, as the revenue from land is rent, from labor wages, and that derived from stock by the person who manages or employs it is called profit. Interest is the compensation which the borrower pays to the lender for the profit which he has an opportunity of making by the use of the money. Part of that profit naturally belongs to the borrower, who runs the risk and takes the trouble of employing it, and part to the lender, who affords him an opportunity of making this profit. Conceiving interest as a derivative revenue, Smith holds it to be a maxim that wherever a great deal can be made by the use of money, a great deal will be commonly given for the use of it, so that we may expect to find the usual market rate of interest to vary with the ordinary profits of stock. The theory which places wealth lowest in the order of goods determines its contribution to human happiness accordingly, and leads to a disapproval of luxuries on the part of both the individual and society. Riches are for the sake of the body, as the body is for the sake of the soul. The latter are good, writes Plato, and wealth is intended by nature to be for the sake of them, and is therefore inferior to them both. And the third, in the order of excellence. Aristotle similarly orders wealth or external goods to health and other goods of the body, as these in turn are subordinate to the virtues or goods of the soul. And Hobbes, in somewhat different terms, holds that of all goods, those that are dearest to a man are his own life and limbs, and in the next degree, in most men, those that concern conjugal affection, and after them, riches and means of living. While Aristotle admits that happiness requires some external prosperity, he always adds that only a moderate amount of external goods is needed. Happiness, whether consisting in pleasure or virtue, or both, he writes, is more often found with those who are most highly cultivated in their mind and in their character, and having only a moderate share of external goods, than among those who possess external goods to a useless extent, but are deficient in higher qualities. Aristotle praises Solon for telling Croesus, one of the world's wealthiest men, that happiness requires more than riches. The conversation is narrated by Herodotus. "What, stranger of Athens," Herodotus reports Croesus as saying, "is my happiness, then valued so little by you, that you do not even put me on a level with private men?" To which Solon replies, "Croesus, I see that you are wonderfully rich, and the lord of many nations. But he who possesses a great store of riches is no nearer happiness than he who has what suffices for his daily needs, unless luck attends him, and so he continue in the enjoyment of all his good things to the end of his life." Aristotle adds the further observation that one can, with but moderate possessions, do what one ought, and that a good life requires a supply of external goods in a less degree when men are in a good state, and in a greater degree when they are in a lower state. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle so far as the happiness of the active life is concerned, but he holds that wealth does not conduce to the happiness of the contemplative life. Rather is it an obstacle thereto. With regard to achieving the happiness of heaven and the life hereafter, Aquinas not only thinks wealth an obstacle, but he also explains why the religious orders take the vow of voluntary poverty. "Man is directed to future happiness by charity," he writes, "and in the attainment of the perfection of charity, the first foundation is voluntary poverty, whereby a man lives without property of his own." The opinion that wealth is an obstacle, or that it should be sought in moderation, does not seem to be universally shared, as Herodotus, Plato, and Aristotle report the prevalence in the ancient world of the notion that external goods are the cause of happiness. So Melville reflects that in modern society, the urban activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah! How cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition. Marx quotes a still more extravagant claim in a letter from Jamaica in 1503. Christopher Columbus exclaims, "Gold is a wonderful thing. Whoever possesses it is lord of all he wants. By means of gold, one can even get souls into paradise." Against Rousseau's attack upon opulence as the cause of civilization, with all its miseries, Dr. Johnson rises in the defense of luxuries and the advantages of wealth. Rousseau's treatise on the inequality of mankind, Boswell writes, was at this time a fashionable topic. It gave rise to an observation by Mr. Dempster that the advantages of fortune and rank were nothing to a wise man. To this, Dr. Johnson replies, "If a man were a savage, living in the woods by himself, this might be true, but in civilized society external advantages make us more respected. Sir, you may make the experiment. Go into the street and give one man a lecture on morality and another a shilling, and see which will respect you the most. And, sir," he continues, "if 600 pounds a year procure a man more consequences, and, of course, more happiness than £6, the same proportion will hold as to 6,000, and so on, for as opulence can be carried. Perhaps he who has a large fortune may not be so happy as he who has a small one, but that must proceed from other causes than from his having the large fortune. For ceteris paribus, he who is rich in a civilized society must be happier than he who is poor. On one occasion, Dr. Johnson seems to share Solon's view. When Boswell suggests that the proprietor of a great estate must be happy, he exclaims, "Nay, sir, all this excludes but one evil, poverty. But for the most part, his opinion is that it is in refinement and elegance that the civilized man differs from the savage. And that is right for every society to be as luxurious, and that it is right for every society to be as luxurious as it can be." Many things which are false are transmitted from book to book. He says in General Oglethorpe, he says to General Oglethorpe, and gain credit. Many things which are false are transmitted from book to book, and gain credit in the world. One of these is the cry against the evil of luxury. How the truth is that luxury produces much good. Now the truth is that luxury produces much good. You will hear it said very gravely, why was not the half-guinea thus spent in luxury given to the poor? To how many might it have afforded a good meal? Alas, has it not gone to the industrious poor, whom it is better to support than the idle poor? You are much surer that you are doing good when you pay money to those who work as the recompense of their labor than when you give money in charity. And as to the rout that is made about people who are ruined by extravagance, it is no matter to the nation that some individuals suffer. When so much general productive exertion is the consequence of luxury, the nation does not care, though there are debtors in gaol. Dr. Johnson's pronouncements may silence Mr. Dempster and General Oglethorpe, but not Smith or Marx. To Smith, spendthrift extravagance squanders wealth, which might have been capitalized for productive purposes. To Marx, the multiplication of luxury products diverts labor power that is socially necessary for producing the means of subsistence into what Veblen later calls forms of conspicuous waste. Not only, in Marxist view, can the capitalistic system be charged with indifference as to whether its profits are made out of the production of luxuries or necessities, but the workers on starvation wages engaged in the luxury trades constitute a signal indictment of the inequitable distribution of wealth. As the needs of the individual are thought to set a natural limit to his acquisition of wealth, or at least to provide him with a rational standard for stopping short of wanton luxuries, when he seeks the decencies or amenities of life, so the needs of society as a whole are thought to establish a criterion of justice in the distribution of wealth. God gave the world to men in common, says Locke, and the measure of property nature has, well set by the extent of man's labor and the convenience of life. No man's labor could subdue or appropriate all, nor could his enjoyment consume more than a small part, so that it was impossible for any man, this way, to entrench upon the right of another, who would still have room for as good and as large a possession, after the other had taken out his, as before it was appropriated. Which measure did confine every man's possession to a very moderate proportion, and such as he might appropriate to himself without injury to anybody in the first age of the world. This rule of property, that every man should have as much as he could make use of, without prejudice or inquiry to others, worked well in the beginning when, as Locke puts it, all the world was America. It would still hold in the world without straitening anybody, Locke thinks, since there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants. Had not the invention of money, introduced by consent, larger possessions, and a right to them. For gold and silver being relatively imperishable, men can hoard excesses of them without appearing to waste them, as they would if they amassed perishable commodities which they could not consume or use. It is not money, but property itself, which Rousseau claims to be the origin of inequality among men, and of the inequitable distribution of wealth. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. Once established as a right, property tends to expand. The larger proprietors avoid the question, "Do you not know that numbers of your fellow creatures are starving for want of what you have too much of?" Instead of, according to Rousseau, they conceive the profoundest plan that ever entered the mind of man to protect their possessions against invasion or plunder. They institute civil government, ostensibly for the security of all, but really to secure for themselves their property and power. Such was, or may well have been, Rousseau writes, the origin of society and law, which bound new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty, externally fixed the law of property and inequality, converted clever usurpation into unalterable right, and for the advantage of a few ambitious individuals, subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. Adam Smith seems to agree. Where there is no property, he says, or at least none that exceeds the value of 2 or 3 days' labor, civil government is not so necessary. Civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality for the defense of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. But unlike Smith, Rousseau has an alternative to propose. since it is plainly contrary to the law of nature that the privileged few should gorge themselves with superfluities, while the starving multitude are in want of the bare necessities of life. He thinks it is one of the most important functions of government to prevent extreme inequalities of fortunes, not by taking away wealth and its possessors, but by depriving all men of means to accumulate it, not by building asylums for the poor, but by securing the citizens from becoming poor. This states an end, but not the means for achieving it. The problem of poverty is not so easily solved, if it can be solved at all, once the right of property is admitted. Rousseau, for example, no less than Locke and others before him, affirms the right, which for Kant and Hegel later is almost the whole substance of private or abstract right. The right of property, says Rousseau, is the most sacred of all the rights of citizenship, and even more important in some respects than liberty itself. Yet it is difficult, he admits, to secure the property of individuals on one side without attacking it on another, and it is impossible that all the regulations which govern the order of succession, wills, contracts, etc., should not lay individuals under some constraint as to the disposition of their goods, and should not consequently restrict the rights of property. To Hegel, poverty seems to be an inevitable consequence of property, as war is an inevitable consequence of sovereignty, and in neither case can the cause be abolished. When the masses begin to decline into poverty, as they must, they can be supported from public funds and private charities, thus receiving subsistence directly, not by means of their work, or as an alternative. They might be given subsistence indirectly through being given work. But, Hegel adds, in this event, the volume of production would be increased, but the evil consists precisely in an excess of production and in the lack of a proportionate number of consumers, or themselves also producers, and thus it is simply intensified by both of the methods by which it is sought to alleviate it. Hence, Hegel concludes, it becomes apparent that despite an excess of wealth, civil society is not rich enough to check excessive poverty and the creation of a penurious rabble. This inner dialectic of civil society thus drives it, or at any rate a specific civil society, to push beyond its own limits and seek markets and its necessary means of subsistence in other lands which are either deficient in the goods it has overproduced or else generally backward in industry. Imperialism, according to Marx, will not long work as a cure for what Tawney later calls the sickness of an acquisitive society. The inner frustration which Marx sees manifested in recurring economic crises and depressions of greater and greater magnitude. Nor does he propose the abolition of all private property as the remedy for poverty when he calls for the expropriation of the expropriators. On the contrary, only the possession of each individual of an adequate supply of consumers' goods can abolish poverty. Differentiating between individual and capitalist property, according as its owners are or are not laborers, and according as it consists in consumable goods or the means of production. Marx would transfer the latter from private property to public ownership. The socialist economy, he outlines, also includes abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolition of all right of inheritance. It includes centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, and also centralization of the means of communication and transport. Last but not least, it includes equal liability of all to labor. More radical than Marx's socialism is the communism Plato proposes in the Republic. Plato's aim is not to solve the problems of poverty or economic injustice. By abolishing for his guardian class all private property, he hopes that his guardians, through sharing common possessions, including wives and children, will have no cause for rivalry, dissension, or personal ambition. Common possessions should mold them into a fraternity and free them from private interests to work for the common good. In this matter of property, the condition of Plato's imagined guardians was not so different from that of Jesus' disciples, as recounted in the book of Acts, or of the monastic orders whose vows include that of voluntary poverty. Aristotle's criticisms of the arrangements of the guardian class in the Republic are largely directed against the community of women and children and the elimination of private property. Property, he says, should be in a certain sense common, but as a general rule, private, for when everyone has a distinct interest, men will not complain of one another, and they will make more progress, because everyone will be attending to his own business. He thinks it is clearly better that property should be private, but that use of it common, in the sense that its use have the common welfare in mind. Not only does Aristotle defend private property on many counts, but he objects to schemes for equalizing it, such as Plato sets forth in the Laws. For one thing, the legislator ought not only to aim at the equalization of properties, but a moderation in their amount. Yet, if the legislator prescribe this moderate amount equally to all, he will be no nearer the mark, for it is not the possessions, but the desires of mankind which need to be equalized. And this is impossible unless a sufficient education is provided by the laws. Whether or not communism is desirable, there are those who think it is impossible, not so much on the level of the economic as on the level of the moral revolution for which Aristotle looks to education. The skeptic thinks human nature cannot be so transformed. It may only be the 20th century that the world is divided into two camps on this subject, but the issue is as old as the Western tradition. At its beginning, Aristophanes expresses the skeptical position in a form that is still current. His Ecclesiazusei Ecclesiastes simply laughs at the idea that inequalities of property can ever be done away with by law or by education. All right. 2 more chapters to go. It actually went faster than I thought it would. I think that was 11.5 pages. Astronomy is 10.5. World is 12. So I keep getting up at 6 a.m. I can take a shower and get to work on time. Yeah, I think it's sort of strange being a human being in the world where we have these wants and needs and limited resources, and where some people are well provided for and others sort of starve off and die for whatever reason. And it's strange because we can conceive of the idea of that not being the case in like a Garden of Eden type scenario. It's like, why can't we just always have everything we need, you know? Why do we have to have this struggle for survival? And, you know, people who acquire wealth, either honestly or through other means, they probably really enjoy it because it, you know, sort of alleviates the pains of mankind since our outcast from Eden, Garden of Eden, at least for them. But, you know, it wasn't just probably wasn't just the material aspects of paradise that were lost in the fall of man. But supposedly in the afterlife, things are different. or the kingdom of heaven, as Christ would say. There is no scarcity. But there is a certain satisfaction in overcoming the pains of scarcity. Acquiring wealth by, using the powers that God gave you. I think these economists, they try to. I like how they always seem to end the chapters well. With but then this guy said this, and he's probably the most correct. It seems to be how they end these intro chapters. The economists just doing everything they can to sort of understand how the world could somehow ever be fair for everybody. There must be some way to institute, the right laws or something, where everyone will, get along and no one will die from lack of possessions or necessities, or no one will get upset that they have less than somebody else. It's not going to happen. It's not what this world is. It's not what mankind is. We're part angel, part animal. And we have a limited lifespan with limited resources. And it's just a ubiquitous deficiency in understanding what what we're doing here.